Welcome to Mysterious Mars. In this episode, we're going to be getting up close and personal with the so-called face on Mars. So we're going to start off by talking about the big picture and whether or not I think it's an actual face or not. And from there, we'll take a look at some terrain samples from the surrounding plane. And then we'll also look at some sample images from around the mound itself. And we'll end up by comparing it to some other regions in Cydonia. So let's take a moment to consider whether this is really a face or not. I actually don't think we can tell whether we're looking at a face here or not. I think this mound, or whatever it is just too highly eroded and broken down from whatever it used to be to draw a lot of conclusions about what it has looked like in the past. You can see very much on this side of it, it looks highly eroded or broken up and fractured compared to this side. And I think it's just kind of hard to draw any conclusions about what it might have looked like in the past with just how highly degraded it is. From what we see here, I definitely don't think this looks like a face. I know the face people have made a big deal out of the lighting, and they claim that this particular image was taken in a way so that the lighting kind of obscures the fact that it's actually a face. It's kind of like that Seinfeld episode where Jerry's girlfriend is very attractive when the light's just right, and he finds her very unattractive when the lighting's wrong. So the face people kind of have that sort of vibe going on. I don't think it's just a matter of the lighting here. However, what is very striking, I think anyone who sees this particular surface feature for the first time will immediately notice, is the amazing symmetry it possesses. So it has an extraordinary amount of bilateral symmetry, and that just means along the axis of its length, each side is very similar to the other. That does seem rather extraordinary for a naturally formed mound. Just the overall shape of it, from let's just call it the top of it to the bottom of it, it has a very interesting, extraordinary shape in addition to the symmetry. I'm not sure how well a lot of symmetry can tell us whether a surface feature is artificial in nature. I'm not sure that you can go with that alone, but it is quite striking. I would also note that highly symmetrical mound-like features are not uncommon on the surface of Mars. And in fact, I've come across other mound-like features that have a much higher degree of bilateral symmetry than what we see here. And those will be showing up in future episodes. I don't know if anyone has done some kind of statistical analysis of what the odds are of a highly symmetrical mound forming through natural processes on the surface of Mars, or even on Earth for that matter, I guess. I'm not sure if it's even possible to do some kind of calculation like that. If it is, it would be interesting to know that. With that out of the way, let's dive in and start looking at some close-up samples of this particular observation. So here we have a close-up of some of the terrain adjacent to the central mound. So the surrounding terrain has some smooth areas, and then it has these patches where it's fairly rugged. And we see a combination of that in this particular image. So in this area, it's a bit smoother. It has some general lumpiness to it, but overall, the surface is relatively smooth compared to this area in through here, where you see a rather broken surface with a lot of jagged openings and higher material kind of poking out of that. I found this material in here particularly interesting. It just has a very delicate and interesting geometry to it. If we magnify it a little bit, you can see that a little more clearly. And a lot of these terrain samples, when we look closely at them, you will see a very fine geometry. Just what I mean by delicate geometry is you have these very fine lines, very kind of intricate shapes going on. We don't have enough detail and clarity for it to be super clear as to what exactly we're looking at, but it's still quite interesting nonetheless. This is another sample from the surrounding terrain. What's noticeable here is we have a very two-tone kind of visual pattern or high contrast. You have this very bright stuff going on, and then in between it, there's a lot of darker material. Down towards this region of the image, you have a lot of darker material. So if we apply a little bit of magnification here, you can see this terrain sample also has a lot of delicate geometry to it. It's kind of hard to see until you really zoom in. But it also looks fairly rugged. It appears like it would be fairly difficult to try to walk across or even attempt to drive some kind of vehicle across it. This is another sample of the surrounding terrain. This is also very rugged in nature. It's not quite as contrasting in its tone and being very light on the one hand and dark on the other, but also looks very rugged and like it would be difficult to traverse. These kinds of features would be very interesting to be able to be there in person and get a very direct look at to see exactly what this would look like if you could be right in front of it. I don't know exactly what it is we're looking at here in any of these images. It doesn't look like ordinary rock and rock layers and sand dunes and so forth. So if anyone has any thoughts or insight into what this could be, please feel free to share those in the comments below. So we're still looking at the surrounding terrain in this image. This is a bit smoother than the others. This particular sample looks more like something you could easily walk across or drive some kind of vehicle across potentially. But if we magnify here, we can also see there's a lot of cracks and crevices in this terrain, although it's maybe not quite as rugged as the other samples. This is our last surrounding terrain sample. This one seems to have an overall finer texture to it than the others. It does look very broken and rugged, but there's somehow a more finely detailed geometry to it. Again, it's hard to know exactly what to make of what we're seeing here. I'm not sure exactly what these surface features could be composed of or how they would be formed necessarily. So that's some of the more interesting terrain samples from around the mound. So now we'll look at a handful of close-ups of the mound itself. So something I found interesting when I started to view the more detailed images of the mound was that a lot of it seems to be composed of discrete units of material. So its surface, at least not in all places, isn't just like a continuous slope of soil or rock or like a smooth rock face. When you zoom into it like this and inspect it more closely, you can see it's definitely composed of chunks of material. And what I mean by that is if you look at some of these features in through here, you can see they're kind of in discrete units, or they come in discrete segments. So you have some of that going on through here. And even out into here, you can see there's like a lot of chunks of material going on up in here too. It looks like you have like chunks of things that are layered on top of each other in through here. So if you're there in person, you could potentially be like pulling individual items out of this mess or digging them out or chopping them out. There's a lot of like just little individual discrete kinds of things. This is another sample from the mound itself. This doesn't look that much different than the surrounding terrain. You have a very similar disrupted surface. It also looks kind of like it would be challenging to navigate across if you were trying to climb it or walk across it. So this material here also is very clearly composed of discrete chunks of material. There's also a lot of delicate and interesting geometry in here. You can see there's a lot of fine elements to it. Again, this is a sample that would be very interesting to be able to look at in person and see exactly what this material looks like up close. Here again, we're looking at a sample from the mound. This looks even more rugged and broken up than the prior samples. And we also see what I'm talking about when I'm saying so much of the mound is composed of discrete chunks of material. This looks very chunky. It's just like a stack of just jumbled chunks of something. It also looks like it would be very hard to navigate if you were there and trying to climb or maneuver across it. But it also looks like it's composed of things you could, again, like pick up or pull apart or dig out and inspect more closely. You just have the slight problem of getting there. Another sample from the mound. This one seems to have a bit finer detail in it than the last one. If we look in here, for instance, you can see there's a lot of fine features. But in general, also looks like a jumbled mess of material of some kind. This is our last mound sample. I found this image particularly interesting. The surface features here seem somewhat more intact. It's just not as eroded or broken down as maybe some of the other samples were. Maybe just the features here are a little more connected to each other, or just have a little more of a definite shape to them. And here again, it's hard to know exactly what we're looking at. Doesn't look like typical rock layers, doesn't look like sand or dirt or an ordinary rock face of some kind. All of these images have a very busy and complex visual pattern to them. They have a lot of intricate components or detail going on, and it'd be very interesting to know exactly what that is or exactly what it is we're looking at here. So this image is a border area between the mound and the surrounding terrain. So this part of the image here is on the mound itself. And when you get out to here, you're just down onto the surrounding plain. And when we zoom in this image, you can see the material that makes up the mound looks very similar to the material out here in the plain. Although the material in the plain is lighter in tone than the material on the mound, but that may be just the result of how the lighting is. This is also very interesting and intricate geometry that deserves much closer scrutiny than what we can achieve from orbit. So I've also looked at some other observations from the Cydonia area. And to be honest, there's actually more interesting regions in Cydonia than this particular region. This image does have some rather interesting things going on in it. But one of the things I noticed is that for whatever reason, the surface material around this particular mound is really broken down or eroded compared to some of the surface features in other regions of Cydonia or even other regions around Mars. And what I mean by that is just that the visual patterns, I guess, are more organized in other Cydonia regions, where there's more of a regular pattern to the surface features. Here, it's a very irregular and highly fragmented visual pattern we're looking at. And so just to illustrate that, our next image is from another area in Cydonia. And you can see there's a bit more cohesiveness to the surface features. They're just in general a bit more intact. And if we zoom in, you can see that maybe even a little more clearly. There's still, it's still kind of eroded and weathered, and as everywhere on the surface of Mars is going to be eroded and weathered. But there seems to be a little bit more of an organized state to the surface features. Either an organized state or just more regularity in their geometry. In future videos, I'm going to feature other observations in the Cydonia region that also kind of illustrate this. This is another sample from another region in Cydonia. This is also an observation that probably would bear a full video unto itself. You can see the visual pattern is very different than the prior two observations, the one with the so-called face and the one we just looked at. So you can see just even within the Cydonia region how different the visual patterns of the surface features are. I found this one particularly interesting just because of all the various openings in the surface. There's like a lot of roundish openings. They aren't all completely roundish, but approximations thereof. And I just found it rather intriguing as to how this kind of surface material would come to be. And in this observation, we also have very delicate geometries going on. You got very thin lines in places connecting various things. and then just all these round openings, or openings, I should say. A lot of them aren't particularly round. You got a lot down here. So it's just interesting to look at these various surface patterns, and it raises the question of how they've come to be. What exactly is going on the surface that gives rise to these very distinct patterns? And it's interesting just how different they are in the same local region of Mars. So that wraps up this look at the face on Mars. So as I said, I don't really believe it to be a face, but when you really zoom in and look at its composition in much more detail, it's still quite remarkable and interesting to examine. And I think we have a lot more to learn about it, how it was formed, why it looks the way it does, both at the bird's eye view and the close-in inspection. I don't know if I can use the term bird's eye view when talking about Mars, but you know what I mean. More generally speaking, Cydonia is a rather fascinating place, and I will be showing a series of other observations in other regions of Cydonia. So stay tuned for that, and thank you for watching.